Welcome to dfwmobile.net. If you're interested in following us, we're at DFW MobileNet on Twitter, and our website is dfwmobile.net. We're also on Meetup as well. I don't have that URL right here. This is our leadership team. Unfortunately, everyone had to be out this week, so it's just me. Tonight is actually our second year anniversary. We've been around for 2 years, so thank you all for coming. Hopefully you all have had as much fun as I've had running this little group. So tonight we're going to talk about Xamarin iOS, looking at the fundamentals, application basics such as model view, controller pattern, creating screens, common controls, basic application behavior. And we'll look at a couple of different ways to generate view controllers, which I'll explain what that is in a second. So I'm Sean Sparkman. I'll be your speaker tonight. I'm the president of the group. I'm also a team lead and senior developer at Infinity Interactive. If you have any questions after the meeting, you can reach me here at sean.sparkman@gmail.com or at my Twitter handle. Next meeting, we'll be meeting on the 14th of October at 6 p.m. and we'll be going over Android as sort of the kind of a series. We're looking at the fundamentals of both. And Hamera will be speaking. Here's his Twitter handle. Hey. So what is Xamarin? Can I have a show of hands who's familiar with Xamarin? Okay. So Xamarin is an SDK which allows you to write C# code for, well, this is an old number, but 2.6 billion devices. I haven't kept up with the latest numbers. That's like a year old. So there are more mobile devices than there are desktops, so it's a lot of devices. So typically when you're writing a mobile application, you architect it in silos because there are different languages for each platform. For iOS, you'd use Objective-C on Xcode or Swift. Probably should update this slide. Or in Android, you'd have a silo for Java and Eclipse. And then if you're lucky enough, you've got Windows apps, whether it's WPF or actual apps for the store, and you'd be writing that in C# and Visual Studio. And this doesn't work well. Now, if you've ever worked at a company where there's like a silo of developers for one project and a silo of developers for another project and a silo of developers for another project, they don't really communicate very well. They have their own ideas of how things should be done, and you end up having one of these groups take the lead and the other ones have to follow. So Xamarin offers a different solution, but it's not the black box solution. And I'm sure y'all are familiar with other products. Maybe I won't name names, but you write JavaScript for it. You kind of shove it in there and it compiles it for that platform, and it spits out an iOS app, an Android app, and a Windows app. You're not always really sure what it's doing under the hood. So if you run into any problems, it's sometimes hard to fix them because you don't know what it's doing. It's a black box. You put in your code and then an app comes out. So Xamarin has a unique approach. So you have C# common across all platforms. You write everything in C#. You have a shared backend. So if you have a REST client or some kind of server-side access, you write it once, which is great, instead of having to write it in Java, Objective-C, or Swift, and then C# if you've got a Windows app. And then you have the different UIs. And the reason why you want to write the UI separately is because an iOS app should be like an iOS app. The flow should be like an iOS app. The UI should look like an iOS app. You don't want to have an Android-looking app in iOS in the App Store. Your users won't like it. They'll get confused. They won't know how to use the app, and vice versa. You don't want an iOS-looking app in Android. The tabs are supposed to be in a certain spot. And for, developers, it's pretty easy to make the switch because you know what to look for. But the common user is going to spend their 3 seconds in your app, get frustrated, and uninstall it. So that's why having separate UIs is good, because then you write an iOS-looking app with an iOS feel, with the buttons in the right place, the tabs in the right place, the menus in the right place, and you have an Android app that has all the buttons, tabs, menus in the right place, and the flow works how it should. But you're still saving quite a bit of time, maybe up to 70, 75% by having the shared backend. That's pretty close to what I've seen and what I've heard others share as far as their code sharing across platforms when they're using that shared backend. So what do you get with Xamarin? All right, so when you're using Windows APIs, y'all are all familiar with the .NET framework. Who here writes .NET? Okay. Well, in the .NET framework, you have system.NET. You're doing your network communication, HTTP calls, that sort of thing. You have system, string, all that lovely stuff, system.io, system.link, which is really cool for writing queries, and system.xml, which nowadays I try to avoid. JSON's much more fun. And then you also have the Windows-specific APIs, Microsoft Device, Foundation, Storage, Networking, Phone, that are on that platform. So you don't get rid of access to your platform APIs, and you have the .NET framework. And the same goes for iOS. You still have access to all of the APIs that you would in iOS, and you have the .NET framework. So is anybody here written an iOS app not in Xamarin or PhoneGap or something like that? Okay, so are y'all familiar with these libraries? Okay, so yeah, you still have access to these. You're still writing C#. It's lovely. And the same goes with Android. So you still have .NET. You can still write your shared backend using .NET. And then you have the Android APIs. And there's a lot more than this. This is just for the slide showing an example. You have access to all of them. So anything you can do in Objective-C, Swift, or Java, you can do it with C# in Xamarin. Pretty simple. Probably shouldn't even have to read the slide to you. So how do they do it? So not only are you writing it in C# and compiling it, you're compiling it to a native app. So you have native performance, native UI. So in the case of iOS, you have to do, so a typical .NET app does just-in-time compiling, and you have reflection and all that. In iOS, you have ahead-of-time compiling, which limits a little bit on the reflection because you have to compile it ahead of time. Apple has said that you cannot make an app that you run based off of, basically you can't do Flash, right? You can't download an app into your app and run that app. So you can't download code and run it. Now, there are people who skirt that. But so what else does Xamarin bring to the table? We're not going to go over it. I'm not going to show you this tonight, but they have their own designer for Xamarin. For Android. It's one of the best out there I've seen. The other ones are catching up, but I really prefer it. It's nice, clean, Doesn't drive me batty with huge load times. If you've ever loaded Eclipse. And also Xamarin Designer for iOS. It supports auto layout, constraints, size classes. Event handling. So I will show you the demo here in a little bit of how you can use it. If you're familiar with doing Windows Form app development, that's kind of what iOS development's like. But the designer, you can double click to get click events, but that's not what they call it in iOS. You can drag and drop controls on the designer. So let's get to the demo. All right, so who here wants to actually try to follow along and do this as I go? Is anybody?
I might try. I don't want to slow you down.
Okay.
I might try, but just go your pace.
Okay.
I can't keep up, that's fine.
Well, just let me know if I'm going too fast. All right, so I'm going to show you a new instance of Xamarin Studio. And tonight, I'm just going to use Xamarin Studio. You can use Visual Studio. I typically use Xamarin Studio in my demos, but I have done development in Visual Studio extensively for iOS and Android, and it's pretty fast. But I don't like switching between parallels on a projector. It doesn't do well. I've had some sizing issues where the resolution just goes crazy. So I'm going to just focus on Xamarin Studio tonight. Okay. And Xamarin Studio is a really good IDE. I really like it. I've done extensive development in Xamarin Studio too. They both have their benefits, their pros that the others don't.
Game Circus uses Xamarin Studios as like a code editor.
Yeah. So this is based off of MonoDevelop, I think. Do you know? I mean, they've split, right? Quite a bit.
What do you mean? Or so it's all there's a plugin or an add-in system for MonoDevelop, and so basically a lot of the Xamarin Studio components, like the designer and everything, that's just an add-in that goes in there and some of the Xamarin specific branding, but it's still basically MonoDevelop.
Yeah, well, it's a lot better looking than MonoDevelop.
Yeah, that's just some of the extra.
Yeah, they've made some.
It's just MonoDevelop.
Yeah, they've made some big improvements. I really like what they've done with it. They've shown it a lot of love. So you're familiar with Xamarin's Visual Studio. You've got solutions. So you can take a project from one IDE to the other with relatively no pain points. So you start out with a new solution. So I've gone ahead and I have iOS selected. But you have your different project types on the left here, project templates. Tonight we're just going to focus on iOS. Sorry. So these pop out with a storyboard. So I selected the single page view. Or single view app, right? And hit next. So you can name your app. And this is the Apple identifier for your app. It's used in your provisioning profiles and all that lovely stuff. You can choose to target iPad and iPhone, or just one of them. And then your target iOS. The adoption rates for upgrades for iOS is pretty high, so I wouldn't worry as much with iOS as you would with Android. And then you can name the project. So the previous screen was the solution name. And this is the project name, and then you can change the solution name here as well. Location. You can have it automatically create a .git, set up your Git, local Git repo, and it shows you the file structure over here. And I'm just going to hit create.
So you selected your target framework is 8.4.
Yeah, 8.4.
So does that mean it's backwards compatible, or do you have to build an app for each one of those, target each one of those iOS devices specifically?
You need to target like the minimum version that you want
Yeah.
to use. So like if you're not going to use any features from 8.4, you could target 8.0 and it'll work with everything going back to 8.0 and it'll be forward compatible.
So as
But
far
if you target 8.4, nobody using 8.0 is going to be able to use your app.
right. So yeah, so you want to do 8.0. You don't want to go. You can't go any lower really, because the store requires you to submit with the unified API, and I believe I don't know of any way to compile for below 8.0 for unified. So pretty much that's as low as you can go, and if you want in the App Store. I could be wrong. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's maybe worth mentioning, like, we pretty much always have basically same-day support for the new release. So, like, when iOS 9 comes out, we'll probably support it, like, same day or possibly next day for PC9.
So is that why, like, like, let's say the Bank of America app or something like, sometimes I get on my iPad or something like that and it says you have to upgrade your operating system in order to use the app. Is that because they haven't written different versions of the app for?
When are you getting the message?
Oh, I mean, I used to get it like, all the time. So I've got it.
Are you getting it inside the app or trying to load the app?
I mean, just basically when you go to launch the app, it's happened to me a couple times. Anyway, I just.
Yeah, that means they compiled it for a newer version of iOS.
Okay.
So they selected 8.4
Yeah.
for whatever reason.
And they're forcing you to upgrade. They don't want to have to maintain.
Right.
They want you to upgrade your OS.
Yeah. So the adoption rates, like I said, are really high for iOS. It's not a big deal to upgrade like it is for Android. Android, the carriers have some phones that are locked into certain versions and they won't ever upgrade. I wouldn't worry about it too much. I would think 8.0 would be a good one. When 9.0 comes out, Apple will list the adoption rate. They're pretty public about it. So just keep an eye on that. And when the numbers look good, then you can upgrade to 9. If you're trying to write an app that shows off the features or shows off your ability with the new features, then go ahead and do it 9. So, and there's a lot of good things coming out in 9 that you have to select 9 to have access to them. So you can always upgrade your app to a different target, and I'll show you how to do that.
Okay.
So
Create different versions and have them all out there at once, basically.
what I would do is, if you're using, hopefully you're using source control, is to create a branch for 9, and then all you'd have to do is select you have to upgrade Xcode and Xamarin. But you can just come in here and target the version you want.
Okay.
Is there any reason not to use Unified now?
Sorry?
Do you know of any reason not to use Unified? Does anybody?
Just if you already had an app that was using the classic API before we had Unified,
I thought they would. I thought they wouldn't even let you submit an update unless it was in.
I don't know, actually. Then I thought you could, but I'm not sure.
Okay. All right. So yeah, what you do is you select the project, select options, and there is I guess it's a tab. You call it a tab. iOS application. And in this first category, there's a deployment target. And you can select 8.0 or 9 or whatever. Okay. Are there any other questions about that? Okay. So the single view creates a basic project. We can go ahead and run it out of the box. I'll get my simulator running. So in order to compile and run iOS apps, you have to have Xcode installed. And so Xamarin Studio uses Xcode, but you don't ever have to open it. You don't have to mess with it. The only part of Xcode that it's going to open is the simulator, unless you're editing Zibs, which you can avoid. If you're using a launch screen, it's probably a Zib, and you'll have to edit that in Xcode. It's pretty painless as long as you're not editing a bunch of Zibs. Then it gets messy. But if you're just doing the launch screen, it's pretty easy, and I'll show you that here in a little bit. But here's the simulator. The thing to note about the simulator is you want to run and test on a device at some point. Things like accessing the controls from outside the UI thread don't always crash the simulator, but it will crash on the device. So that's something you want to look out for. The other thing is if you try to make a phone call with the simulator, or I believe SMS messages also cause problems on the simulator. So you want to test those on devices because you can't test them on a simulator. They do have quite a few options for the simulator. Let's see here. I'll zoom in on that. So they have all the way to 4S. There's no point in really testing on a 4 because you can't upgrade it to 8.0. Anyway, I do have a 4. I was a little irritated to that because I had to go buy a new iPhone to do my development. But they've got 6, 6 Plus, and they come out pretty quickly. So if I was to download the beta for Xcode, I could have 6S when it drops. I don't know if y'all watched the announcement today, but the 6S was announced today. It's called the iPhone 6S, or the iPhone 6S. That's what the S is supposed to stand for. Yeah, I don't know about that. They also announced the iPad Pro, which is a 13-inch iPad. So let's go back to our project here. And like I mentioned before, this is just like a Visual Studio project. It's even got the CS Proj. It looks pretty much the same. There are a few minor differences, but you can open it up in Visual Studio without any problems. So let's start with the app delegate. This is where everything starts at and finishes. It automatically creates or overrides these events for you, these methods. They're technically not events. So you might want to use some of these. The finished launching is where you would add a view controller if you're not using a storyboard. And you can even use it for a storyboard, but I'll show you that in a second. So if you want to look at when the app is closing, activating, so on and so forth, that's what you want to look at. You put your code in there. You don't want to put too much in there because there's a time limit on how long, like when you're terminating, how long you can run for. So this is the storyboard designer. Looks a lot like Visual Studio. You got the toolbox over here. Okay. And then we've got what's called a view. No, it's here. Click off that. A view controller. So in iOS development, they do MVC. Are y'all familiar with MVC? It's a little different than what you're used to because the view controller is kind of together. But I'll show you where the view is separate here in a second. And if you're wondering what device this is called size classing. So basically, you can design using constraints for any size, and you can test the different sizes. Where this is important is if y'all are keeping up with Apple events, they're going to be doing snapping in iOS, so you can have 2 apps running side by side. And that gets a little wonky because you can like change the sizes, right? And so you're no longer constrained to the size of the device, you're constrained to the size of your window. So if you want to jump over to the different sizes just to see what your app looks like, you can do so from this little drop down here, View As, iPhone 6, iPhone 5S. Any questions about that? Okay. So the toolbox has got quite a few things in it. We're going to ignore these view controllers for now and jump down here to the controls. And you've got, excuse me, you've got all the basic controls. You got like a progress, well, not a progress, a busy indicator, a button, a label, progress view, slider, stepper, switch, text box. And then you've got some of the more advanced data views, and then gestures and some other things, navigation bar. So we're going to drop a label on here. You see that blue, let's see if I can zoom. Well, I can't zoom while I'm dragging, can I? Do that again. All right, so you see the little blue dashed line? That's your snap to. And like I mentioned before, this is kind of like Windows form development. You're dealing with pixels. You're setting the top and the left and the width and the height, right? But the auto constraints are also available. So if I select the control and then I click it again, I have these weird little tabs, I guess. And that allows me to do constraints. Yeah.
How do you get the storyboard in Visual Studio?
Have they released the designer in stable?
I don't know. I don't use
Would you?
Visual Studio.
Oh, you don't. You have to have build host set up, connected to it. You can't do it on a Windows device. So the one of the annoying things is Apple has as part of the EULA, and a part of their agreement, if you submit an app, you have to compile your app on Apple hardware. You can't compile it in a VM or on any other device besides Apple hardware. There's some other companies that have gotten around it somehow. I'm not really sure how. But to do Xamarin iOS development, you have to compile it on Apple hardware. There's a couple of different solutions for that. You can have a Mac Mini, and you can do a remote build host and connect to it through Visual Studio like he might be able to do. There's some pros and cons to that. You can do it on your laptop. You don't have to buy an Apple laptop, which is nice because Apple is a little pricey when it comes to their laptops. Though you have to connect to the Mac Mini to do the simulator. You can plug in an iPhone or another device to that, have it deploy to that device, and then test it without having to open up a remote desktop or VNC screen to the Mac Mini or the Mac hardware that you're compiling on. The other alternative is to get a Mac laptop, this is what I've done, and have parallels running Windows and then the remote build host running an OS X and then using Visual Studio inside Parallels or whatever VM software you want to use.
So you could, if I was, so I will run a Windows VM on this thing. So if I wanted to, I could do the build on the Windows VM and use my Mac as my host to do the remote build.
Yes. So you can still use Visual Studio, which there's a lot of benefits to that, like ReSharper, Code Rush, different things of that nature.
So as long as we're talking about it with a, let's say like a dual core to Mac Mini with a gig of RAM, would that suffice?
Not a gig, right?
Or do you need like something a little bit beefier?
I would get something a little beefier.
If you can run a VM, I got 16 on that one. But,
So
If you're using like a Mac Mini just for build host and using a separate machine.
Oh,
yeah.
probably
I think that's probably fine.
two minimum, I'd say.
I get 2 gigs. So right now, my company is running our build server on a Mac Mini with a dual core and a gig of RAM, and it works for continuous integration, not for remote build hosts. So it was a little slower for that.
I'm just looking for an inexpensive solution just because I got all these costs mounting.
Right. Yeah, unfortunately, if you want to do iOS development, you have to have Apple hardware. There's another solution. You could potentially get Mac in the cloud. I looked at them before. The main problem I had with them is that unless you get a dedicated server, you couldn't upgrade Xamarin Studio. They'd have to upgrade it for you. And every so often they reset the box, so you lose everything. So you have to keep everything on the cloud.
Go onto like the Xamarin forum and just ask like if anybody has like a cheap Mac Mini that they're using just for a build host, and just find out like if 1 gig, because I don't really know offhand if 1 gig RAM is fine just for building on.
I don't even. I originally did. I did a Mac Mini with 2, and you get that for like $300 or $400.
Yeah.
But I don't know if you can buy one with 1 gig of memory. I don't even think anything.
Well, I saw one on Amazon for like $150. Something like that.
Oh, for with 1 gig?
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely try to get 2 gigs. You can upgrade them though. They're not like the MacBook Pros.
Yeah, I'm just not a Mac guy. My iPad's a toy, so.
Yeah. Yeah, so the problem with mobile development, and it's regardless of what platform you're using it on, it's going to cost you money. Now, if you're looking for how much it's going to cost, I'd avoid Jesse Liberty's post about it, because he was saying it's like $12,000, but he bought like the best of everything and then some, which is kind of ridiculous. But when you're doing iOS development, you want a test device, and if your main phone isn't an iPhone, then you're going to have to pay the extra cost of keeping up to date with that and buying the device, probably buying the device outright. With iPhone, you won't necessarily have to have as many different versions, right? Because they don't change as much between devices, and it's one manufacturer basically. It's Apple. With Android, you're going to want to have multiple test devices, even if you're using the test cloud, because you want to test yourself. You want to be able to use it before you use those test cloud hours, and you want to be able to debug stuff locally when you're trying different things out. Now, you can't have every Android device or even the top major ones, but having like 3 or 4 is a good idea to plan for, right? If you're going to support iPad, you want an iPad, right? That's another cost. It's not cheap like it is doing web development, because then you don't have to have as many devices to test. You don't have to have the mobile devices, though. Even in web development, if you're going to do quality QA, you're going to want to test it on devices, right? But even doing development, you should have devices. So there is a lot of undiscussed costs with doing it. So I would recommend, if you're going to do iOS development, is to have a Mac Mini if you're going to run on Windows. And I wouldn't cheap out on it too much, because you're going to burn cycles waiting on it to compile and deploy. Then you're going to connect to it to place a simulator, or you're going to deploy it to a device, right? And then that's your time. Your time is valuable. So think of it that way when you're buying these things or budgeting for these things. So I know I got off on a tangent, but did that answer your question?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. All right. So let's go back to constraints. So constraints are pretty simple. I grab this little tab, and in this case, I want it to stretch across the screen. All right, and it shows it's orange. So there's two things that orange indicates. One, that I don't have all constraints. You need 4 constraints per control in most cases. Or that when I was doing the blue snapping with the little tabs in the corner, doesn't match what it will look like when I run it, because the constraints take priority over what your pixels settings are, because it still keeps those pixel settings even though you've created constraints. Does that make sense? So the top, the left, the height, and the width are still there. And that's what it's showing you on the screen, right?
How do you make it?
So to get to the constraints, like this? Is this what you're seeing?
Mine's not turning yellow at all. Mine's staying blue.
What? Where is he? Yellow?
That's what I'm going with that. I can get you.
Okay.
Whatever color that is, I don't know.
The projector might change the colors a little bit. Maybe I should tell you what colors these are. So this is orange, right? And so you grab one of these tabs, and you can drop it on the top layout guide, or you can drop it on the top of the screen. If you start adding like the navigation bar and the status bar, and you don't set the view controller correctly, it'll be underneath the nav bar, and then you can't see it, and it's a pain in the keister. You can also set the constraints based off of height or width. Let's see if you can see that. By using these little eye beams, right? And I'm going to go ahead and say the height. So now the constraints, so that orange went away, and my pixels match my constraints. However, there's a little handy little button here that if I ever were to drag this off, it would go orange again. And then there's this button here. Let's see if I can get the tooltip in there, to update the frame based on constraints. And bam, it's fixed. And you're probably going to see this a lot more than you think you will. Does that make sense to everybody?
So you're saying that orange is like UI's way of telling you that your pixels on the screen don't match up with your constraints?
Right. So the constraints are executed at runtime, right? Because you could have different devices. You're not going to compile. You're not going to say, you know, create pixel values based off of the constraints at, you know, compile time. You're going to do it at runtime. All right. Then another way to look at your constraints. So you have a properties tab, just like Visual Studio. And you have your normal name, different properties, right? You can set your color, your text. I'm going to change it to DFW Mobile. Your font size, font color, alignment, all that stuff. There's also a tab called Layout, and you can scroll down here, and it shows you what your constraints are actually set to. And as you can see, there's 4 constraints. If you have more than 4, it tends to throw an error and it doesn't like you then. So if you're looking at the label now, and I set it to DFW Mobile, it's too long. So it puts in a little ellipse and hides the rest of my text. So we want to make it bigger. Oops, I broke my constraint. It doesn't match the pixels. So, zoom out, zoom in. So I want to get rid of that constraint. You can come down here and delete it. You can also select the constraint and hit the delete button as well. And I can come back over here and re-add it, or I could change the number and fix it in the Properties tab. So now I can see my whole label, because DF didn't really tell me what it was. All right, everybody good so far? So let's add some more controls. Let's add a button. So there's my button. Add my constraints real fast. And I'm going to have it constrained based off of where the label is. I want it to follow the label, right? And then I'm going to, let's see here, set height and width. Does it like me now? Okay. So now I have a button. Now, if you're used to doing Windows Forms development, WinForm, you can just double click it, right? And then so this is the code behind. When I double click the button, and it's asking me to add the event handler. And so it's coming into the view controller code behind as far as WinForms and web forms terminology goes. And then I can add the event. I didn't name the button, so it creates a name for me. Right? So let's look at the code for this. So if you come over here to the Solution Explorer, I have a view controller, and that's the code we're looking at right here. And then we have the designer underneath. And this is the generated code from the storyboard, right? It generated this partial event, and it can, we have the designer outlets. So if we want to make something show up there, we'll go over to this Properties tab, set widgets. So if we want to access like the button, we need to name it, right? Y'all are used to naming things. So just call it generic button. Y'all can figure out what kind of naming standard you want. And then let's name the label. Are you following? Okay. And so we can come back, we're going to save this. And then we'll look at the generated code. And now we have these outlets. Now, if you wanted to, you could actually do this yourself and not have it generate the code for you. It's a pain. I'm not a fan of doing it myself.
Where'd you see that? Outlets at?
All right, so if you go over to the Solution Explorer, you should have a view controller. Expand that, and then there's a view controller.designer.cs. So if you're ever wondering why you say you set a name in the storyboard, and for some reason you're not able to access it in the view controller, look at the designer file. Or maybe why it's a different class or something weird like that. And that's pretty much the same as you'd have with generated code behind for web view or web forms. All right, so we're going to grab that greeting label. And so we've got our lovely I don't know what you call it. IntelliSense is like trademarked by Microsoft, so we can't use that. So we're going to access the text, right? Pretty familiar stuff. Let's just add a counter. So private int count equals 0. And then I'm going to string.format because I'm weird like that. My count is And then I'm going to put my count plus plus. Does that make sense to everybody? So I'm going to set the text for the label with that count. And go ahead and run that. I know, I'm doing a live code demo. So I'm crossing my fingers here that the demo gremlins don't strike me down. I do have a version open that's complete if I have to switch to that. So there we go. So I click the button, the event goes off, 0, 1, so on and so forth, right? Well, if you've ever done development outside of Visual Studio, one of the things that I always miss is breakpoints. So you can set them, there's this little line, I guess, on the left, and you can click to add a breakpoint, right? Bam. I can look at my locals. Here's this. Non-public members, there's my count. It's 6. Just like Visual Studio. And the same thing works in Visual Studio. So you'll be able to access your properties, you set breakpoints, all that lovely stuff. Access count. You can add watch items. And if I don't, sorry, I'm used to using a mouse. I can also mouse over. Let's see here. Mouse over variables and see the value. So if you've ever developed in something besides Visual Studio, you'll appreciate that. All right, so let's see. All right, so let's add something besides just a regular old view controller. Right? How do I zoom out? Okay. So one of the typical structures in an iOS app is navigation controller. To be able to navigate between screens. I like to call them screens, not to confuse them with pages. So I can click the navigation controller and drag it into my storyboard. All right. So the navigation controller, which breaks away from the view controller naming convention, it's kind of our starting point. And then it navigates to that, whatever the root view control for that navigation controller. And then we can add, scroll down too far. Another view controller. Okay. All right, so it's just drag and drop. Is everybody following? Okay. Now I want to navigate to that second page. I'm going to add a button. You just drop it in the middle. I'm not going to bother with constraints right now. And then I'm going to add a segue. So how I do that is I click the button while holding control, and then I drag it over to the second screen. And then I have some different options for how the segue is going to work. There's pop over, all these other lovely different ideas or options. But I'm just going to do show for now and not get too far down that rabbit hole tonight. And then in order for y'all to see the difference, I'm going to change the background color. Now let's do something bright. I like to do obnoxious colors when I'm testing things. That way I know I make myself change them later before I go live. Because nothing says professional like cyan. All right. So we've got our button to navigate to the second page. Let's put a label on there. just because. All right, so there's one important part to actually make this work. So we've got a navigation controller that we added and a root view controller, which is just a view controller, and then another view controller. But we started out over here, so we want to make this our initial view controller. And we can do that by clicking. So anytime you want to edit or do anything to the view controller, you click this gray bar at the bottom. Okay? And that selects the view controller or navigation controller. Right? And then there's this little checkbox here. It's called Is Initial View Controller. And it's under the view controller category. It's under properties. So you check that, and it moves this little arrow, our starting point of the application, over the navigation controller. Let's go ahead and run this. All right, I'm going to cross my fingers here. Bam. So if you missed that, that was real quick. I push the button on the first view controller, and it navigates me to the second view controller. Any questions about that? And if you ever want to come back and edit how it moves to the second one, you can click. Let me zoom in on this. On the, oh gosh. Why is it not letting me edit this? Hello, computer. Well, normally you can click on the segue, and that's what they're called, segues, to edit it, which this gives me an opportunity to show another awesome feature of the IDE, the document outline. So this shows all of the objects on the screen in a tree view. And here is my show segue. I can double click on that. Now I have it selected, and I can pop over here to properties, and I can choose the segue type, and I can identify it. And identifying it is important if you want to push to another page without doing the control drag. So if you wanted some kind of functionality to check, to tell it which segue to execute. The other thing you might want to add is validation. And there's a method you can override, which I'm not going to show you right now. It's called should perform segue. And that'll prevent you from navigating to the second page, say if you haven't filled in your email address, right? When you click, sign in. If you were to do that, so you just go over to the view controller, override, ta-da. It has all the methods, properties I can override. In that case, should perform segue. Bam. And you just return true if you want to perform it after you check, email field.text, whatever condition you want to do. Try some regular expression editor, whatever. Any questions about that? And that segue identifier that I just showed you in the property screen is sent into the method that way. That way, if you have more than one segue, you can check which one you're validating against. Okay. So that's cool. We've got storyboards, the basics of that. Let's look at actually just coding it straight up. So I cheated a little bit on this one because there's a lot of typing involved in this one. So I don't think you're going to be able to follow along with this one too well. All right, so let's go back to that app delegate. So if I want to create or have a view controller, I'm going to get my window. UI from create a new window, right? And it has a property. So if you were to create an empty view controller, or an empty iOS app, it does this for you. It generates the UI window code, this code here, here, and here, all right? In order to show a view controller, and it's not going to throw an error if you don't tell it to show a view controller, it just shows you a black screen. So if you ever run your app and wonder where your app is and it's just a black screen, you look under Finish Launching, under your app delegate, right? If you haven't signed the root view controller for window, it'll just show you a black screen, okay? You follow me so far? All right. In order to create this view controller, what I did, I'll just go ahead and show you that, is I went to the project, right-clicked it, said Add New File, and it gives you a lot of different options. There's an iOS tab right here, and there's view controllers and storyboards and other items that I'm not going to discuss right now. Those create zibs. You can use zibs, you cannot use zibs. In this case, I prefer just to use a clean empty class, right? And I named it label view controller. Okay. The naming standard for classes that are view controllers is whatever view controller. That's kind of the standard. I don't know if there's nothing that makes you do that. You can name it whatever you want. It is just a class, right? And in this case, I inherited from UI view controller. Get rid of that partial. And then I have my constructor. And these are some things you might want to add if you're creating a view controller from scratch. And these are things you're just going to have to write down and remember. The first one deals with the little navigation bar problem. If you want your items to show up underneath it and ignore that space underneath it. I think that came around to iOS 7. When you'd add a control to the screen, it would be underneath the navigation bar and the status bar. That would be 0, 0 was the top left underneath those items. If you set this, it'll jump down. The other thing you want to set is the background color, because it will be black. And you will see nothing if you just add labels, because they are black text. So if you're wondering, again, why your screen is black and you don't see your app, set your background color. Okay? Storyboards automatically, all the view controllers, the background color is set to white. So if you're switching between the two, you don't always think about it. So try to keep that try to remember that. We don't really have to do this. I created this from a template. So we just call the base. If we want to release any cache data, if there's a memory error, we can do that here. So there's that's one thing I miss about Visual Studio. There are several events that trigger. If you're familiar with web forms, you've got like page load, page preload, all those different events in the life cycle. View controller has something similar. We've got the view did load, and this loads. This is the first thing that gets triggered. Okay, this doesn't always trigger when you navigate to the page. Okay, so if you're wanting to, whenever you view the page, if you wanted to update the screen, pull something up a REST service or whatever, this isn't going to trigger every time. Only when you knew it, right? I've got some pre-assembled code here that I wish I could minimize, but can't do that in Xamarin Studio. Now, if you do want to do something before the screen loads, but whenever you navigate to this screen, do it and the view will appear. This is before it appears. Okay. Just keep in mind that it's bad user experience that if you've got a really long REST call and the screen isn't loading, it's not going to show the screen until that's done, right? There won't be any progress bar or anything like that showing up. Okay, but this will be called every time you navigate to that page, that screen. Okay. And then the view did appear. That happens after the screen is loaded and is showing, right? The user can now see the screen and this triggers. So a good example of this is Facebook, the Facebook app. It has this little image, basically. I don't know if it's actually an image, but it's got like a little box where your profile picture would go, and then it's got gray bars kind of indicating text. It's kind of a preload page, and it shows that. Then it loads the data, right? You can also trigger stuff off, spin off on a non-thread, and then call the UI thread to update controls if you wanted to do that. Then there's also view will disappear and view did disappear. So the view did disappear triggers after the next page is showing, okay? And the view will disappears before the screen goes away. So just keep that in mind for user experience. You don't want screens taking forever to load. Okay, any questions about that? No, that's kind of long. There's a lot of life cycle items here. Not quite as many with web forms, but okay. Just as a suggestion, if you're going to create controls inside the view controller class, I would recommend them doing it in the load, right? That way you're only doing it once whenever you create the view controller, right? So I'm going to create a label, and this gets really annoying. There are some better ways to do this. You can actually do the constraints in here manually. That's even tedious than writing out the pixels, but it constrains to the page, which is good performance or good user experience. But just like WinForms, you have to specify the pixels, the top, left, width, height. I don't remember if that's the right order. I always check hints. And then I'm going to set the text to howdydfwmobile.net. And then we get to the actual view. So this is the view in the MVC, right? So the view controller's view is the view, right? This is where you're going to want to add all your controls. There is just an add method. You don't have to call the add subview method, but the add method just calls the add subview, so it doesn't. It's like saving a few extra characters if you think you only have so many keystrokes in your lifetime. So let's run that real quick. Oh, I set it to, oh well, I set it to the 4S, sorry about that. And so comes the problem with writing your code all in the view controller, is that you have to run it to see what it looks like. And I cut off my DFW mobile again. Right? So to fix that, I can just add some pixels. Right? If you wanted to, you could just do view size width. View.frame, that's it. Sorry, I've been doing WPF development lately, and then I'm going to -60 from it. And then I have my auto constraints. Of course, this doesn't respond well when I do this to this. It just stays the same size. So you want to, constraints are good. If you want to handle rotating devices, So there's my howdy dfwmobile.net. All right. So navigation. What I'm doing is I'm just uncommenting this code. You can go back later. I've got this on GitHub if you want to see all this. This is just sample code. This is not production ready code. So it's not pretty and it's not my best work. So keep that in mind when you're seeing, my ugly code. So I'm going to add a button. So do not new UI button. Do UI button from type. And there's a number of types. If you're just doing a text, standard, text button, you see in most apps do a rounded rectangle. I had to set the frame again. Something else to think about when you're doing a button is set title. So you don't set the text, you set title. And the reason why you don't set a property is because you have UI control state. So if a button is disabled, you can have it say something else. If the button is highlighted, you could have it say something else. So if you wanted a toggle button, you could have it show something else. I wouldn't do that with text. I'd use an image, but that's just something you can do with it. And then here is the event, touch up inside. So you don't have a click, you have touch up inside. And that's when your finger comes off the button. And then I set the background color so you can see it. Normally I wouldn't suggest doing that. I think that's against the UI guidelines, is coloring your buttons. So let's run that real quick. No, let's not run that real quick. That's going to break. So I'm going to spare y'all real quick. The exception that's going to be thrown is I'm trying to show the view controller, but I don't have a navigation controller. So in order to do navigation, we want navigation controllers. So we have to go back over to this app delegate. In this case, I've already got it written out. So I'm going to comment that out and replace my root view controller. So I want my root view controller to be a UI navigation controller. Okay? And then in the constructor, I just passed the root of the navigation controller, or the view controller I want for the root of the navigation controller. So this is our first screen. Okay? So we're going back to the UI, or we're going back to the label view controller. Okay? And that's in the app delegate. So we hit next, and it sends us to the next page, which I will show you real quick how I did that. So the show view controller is new. Okay. Before they had different methods you'd call depending on what kind of segue you'd want, whether you wanted modal or a popover. And then for the parameter, I pass my new view controller. Okay? Let's take a quick look at that. So in most apps, you want to have some kind of data entry. And instead of a text box or text field, we have UI text field. Okay? And like almost every single controller, or control, we're going to pass it the frame. Now there are different options for this. You can do, you can pass it a rectangle frame. Yeah. Pass it nothing and then set the frame later. I thought there was a, maybe I'm thinking of the label. UI label. Okay, I'm thinking of the rectangle. New CGI rect. You don't have to pass in the pixels. You can pass in a location and a size, X, Y, width, height, double floats, or nothing. and then just set it later. And I went ahead and set the background color for the entry field so you can see it. And then, y'all familiar with placeholder text? So it's the text you see in a form that's like, instead of having a label, you have in the field that says email address. And then when you click into the field, it goes away. Or you start typing, it goes away. Depends on the platform. In this case, that's called attributed placeholder. And you have to use an NS attributed string. And you have to pass the text and the foreground color. Well, you don't have to pass the foreground color necessarily, but the foreground color defaults, I believe, to white. And if your text field is white, then you can't see it, which makes it kind of useless. So I went ahead and set it to a color just to show you. The other thing that you have to think about, which I don't know if y'all have used iPhone, but there are some apps out there that you click in the text field and then you're stuck in the text field. If your login button or whatever button to move to the next screen is hidden by your keyboard, in some of these apps, you get stuck there. You can't scroll up or down to the button. So you have to resign, what's called resign the first responder, to make the keyboard go away. And if you're doing iOS development, it's very easy to forget that in the simulator. Because the simulator is really nice, because I can use my laptop keyboard to type stuff into the text field. That's nice. Not having to do this every time I want to test one little iteration, right? But sometimes it makes the keyboard disappear. The keyboard won't even show up when you're in a text field. And you'll forget that you're hiding a button, you're hiding a field, whatever. So keep that in mind. So let's run this real quick. Oh, we're already running it. Sorry. That makes it easier. All right, so I've got my field. And I click into it, and then my keyboard shows up. Okay? A quick little trick. If your keyboard isn't there, you can go to Hardware, Keyboard, and toggle your software keyboard. Or you can hit the Command key and K. So if you're doing simulator testing, always make sure your keyboard shows up. Because I've had many errors reported by a QA person. Oh, I can't get to the login button, or I can't get to that button. I'm like, oh, God. Right? All right, and then we add it to the view. Any questions about that? Okay. So we got navigation and text field. So let's do a little alert. Some people, these don't bother them. I really don't like them. UI alert view. Okay, so I just added another button. Just incremented the Y on the frame, set the title to alert, and instead of navigating to the next page, I create a UI alert event, which I can pass in the title, the body of the alert, a delegate that goes off whenever you complete it. And this is actually the cancel button. I know it says OK, but it's actually the cancel button. So that means nothing happens. And then the last item is actually an array of strings that you can pass for different buttons. Okay? And then I show it. And to me, this is kind of the equivalent of JavaScript warning or alert. I think they're ugly, but some people don't. A lot of people use them. So there you go. iOS or Apple uses them in their apps, so I guess they're okay for UX. That's up to you. Any questions about that? And if you add the string array, you can add multiple buttons to it. So if you wanted a OK, cancel, whatever your text you wanted, you can do that as well. All right, so the next thing I want to do is make a phone call. And I haven't tried to do this on the device in a long time, or on the simulator. I've done it on a device. When I test, I can't bring myself to click the button usually, because I know it's going to crash. So in order to do that, I created another button, just like the previous one, incremented the Y. And in order to access it, you're going to access the UI application, which is a class, the property of shared application, and call the method of open URL, right? And then anytime you're using a URL in iOS itself, you're going to use this thing called NS URL, okay? So just get used to it. You pass it a string, which is the URL. It's pretty straightforward. And in order to make a phone call, I append tell, and then the number. And I had the window open of all the different types of URLs you could open, and then I closed it. But if you want to see what different types of URLs you can open it, and you can use this for SMS, and I believe email. You also use this for web pages, okay? But I had the list open, and go to Xamarin, developer.xamarin.com, and look for open URL, and it'll tell you. If I wanted to test, so another device that you might have to worry about is an iPod. So you might install this app to an iPod, and you can't make a phone call. So you want to do UI application shared application can open URL, and that'll return a Boolean, right? And you can choose like to display an error message or something like that. Sorry, I'm starting to lose my voice. Instead of trying the URL, which you know is going to fail. Right. Any questions about that? It's pretty straightforward. So let's try and run that. Let's see what it does when I try to call a phone. And yes, the button is too short. Okay, so it does nothing. Which if you were testing, you would think your app's broken because it's not calling. And no, I think that's text messaging. So I did SMS. Okay. I guess that doesn't show anything. But you could replace it with a URL if you wanted to go like Xamarin.com or whatever your site is. That's how you would do it. Any questions about that? All right, so I mentioned before for a toggle button, you might want to have an image. Images are a little different for buttons. So you could technically add an image view and then add a tap gesture, or you can do a button, a UI button from type, UI button type custom. Okay. And I pass in the frame. And then like the set title, we have set images. And then we set the control state. So if I wanted the gray button for toggled off, I'd probably have that as normal, and then have the gold button just highlighted. So why don't I just go ahead and do that? Okay. Let's get the rest. So you can do application, disabled, highlighted, normal, reserved, selected. Does that make sense? Those are the different application control states. Let's see if I can change this real quick. Image button state. All right, and I'm going to run that. Cannot be assigned. It's set state. No. It's highlighted. Hmm? So I'm going to set it to highlighted as true and pray this works. I should never code in live code in a demo. All right, so we've got the gray star button. Does everybody see that? Then I'm going to click it. It says pressed, and it doesn't work. I guess the highlighted for button is if you have it pressed down. So now, if you're ever wondering, oops, scroll down. So I've had this problem before, is if I do like rounded rectangle instead of custom, the button's going to look really weird. And I'll show you here in a second. And this is actually how it says to do it on the Xamarin site. This is wrong, because your button will be whatever your tint color is. I need to send them an email about that. See, it's blue. And that could be useful. So if I had like a graphic like a star and I wanted a particular color, I just set the tint color, right? And the image shows up in that color. And the transparency is, the transparency. So it's a PNG. Are there any questions about that? And this button still works. It doesn't break the button. That's how it's intended to work, I guess. I believe in previous versions of iOS, it would just show you the image. And that's why it's on the Xamarin site like that. Any questions about that? All right, so I'm going to do some crazy stuff. I've got this project that I've been working on that uses navigation controllers inside of tab controllers, which I haven't shown you tab controllers. I'm going to show you tab controllers here. And so I wanted to make sure that I could navigate from a specific page on another tab from the first tab. And so I wrote this little test project, and it actually worked. It was a little confusing to do at first. So I've got my app delegate, and I'm calling it root tab view controller. That's what I named it. Okay, that's not something in the framework. That's my class. So I've got root tab view controller, and I'm mix and matching with storyboards and view controllers that I've written from scratch. So in order to load a storyboard, I can do UI storyboard from name. Okay, and that loads the storyboard. And if you want to come over here, and it's, what was the name of it? First and second. So first is right there. Second is right there. And it's just a storyboard. There's nothing special about it. Okay. In order to get a view controller out of it, I do instantiate view controller. Okay. Instantiate initial view controller. So if you remember me showing you earlier that little circle with the arrow coming out of it, and whatever view controller that points to is what gets what's generated here. So first is set to that initial view controller. Second is set. Okay. So root, my root tab view controller is a class that inherits from UI tab bar controller. Okay, so anything like tabs, navigations, they kind of break away from that view controller. They're just controllers. Okay. Now there's a property for UI tab bar controller. I gotta find a shorter way to say that. There's a property called view controllers, and it's an array of view controllers. Surprise, surprise. And I just create a new one and pass it first and second. Okay, so if you're familiar with iOS development, that creates two tabs, pages, two tab screens, and a tab bar toolbar at the bottom. And if I want to set the title, I can set it here. I can actually set it on the view controller itself, which technically I'm doing right here, but I could do it in the storyboard and set it there to determine what the title is, and that's one of those little properties. But I'm just grabbing the tab bar item from the view controller and setting it. And then I have to set the selected view controller to first. And just like any other view controller, we have all these little events, which I don't have to override. They can just call the base. Okay. Are you all following me so far? So I want to run this. Probably should have started this sooner. Lovely. Oh, I have to show you that too. All right, so here are my, oh, if you ever run into this problem, so the simulator is bigger than the screen, okay? You can't see the bottom. That's a problem. You go to Window, not Zoom, Scale, and you set the scale of the simulator. And it's kind of limited. You've got 5 options, sorry. So you can't go above 100 if you're in Retina mode. And so I've got my 2 tabs. I can create an image for it for each one and set it. It runs into that same problem we saw with the UI button before. It's going to be the tint color. You're not going to see the image itself. It's going to use the transparency and then overwrite the actual content with the tint color. So keep that in mind. You can create custom tab bars. They're not hard. So you can just access this tab, or you access your UI tab bar controller, and you set the selected index, and it'll switch it between the tabs, whatever you set it to. Okay, and just create a button, create your event, and then have it set that selected index. It's pretty easy. So what else? So let's look real quick at the storyboard. I'm going to try to wrap this up real quick. Sometimes it takes a little bit to load these. Doesn't help that I've got 3 instances of Xamarin Studio open. While that's, okay, here it is. All right, so here's my view controller. I don't have the tab bar at the bottom, right? When I add it to the tab bar controller, it adds it and then shows those tab bar items. I've got a navigation controller inside the tab bar, and I have my view controllers underneath that, right? Something to take note of, when we created that single view, it automatically created our view controller, right? That's not always going to be the case. If we add a new view controller, it's not going to have that class behind. We have to create it. So if you go down to the properties, there's a class property. And you can select one of the existing view controllers, or you can type in your own name and it'll generate it from scratch with its template. Okay, and pop this up. This is the yellow view controller. Okay, there's nothing to it. Not really. Let's just prepare to move. Okay. And it does create this designer. If you don't want the designer, for whatever reason, the designer class, you can delete this file, but it's gonna cause you a problem. Okay. This register, which is part of the generated file, needs to be here in your class. Okay. If it doesn't have the register, it doesn't connect to the storyboard and it throws an error. But if you're dealing with outlets, I'd leave the designer there. It adds your controls there so you can access them. You don't have to think about it. All right, so this is the weird thing that I did, is I grabbed that first storyboard. It's a static property or static variable, instantiated this view controller. So before I was instantiating the initial view controller, this is a specific one, and this refers to an ID that's set in properties. Storyboard ID. Okay, so if you ever want to pop in, say you receive a notification, if you ever want to pop into a specific screen, like a detail for that push notification, you need this ID. Okay. And then let's look at, whenever you create a new project, this is newer in Xamarin Studio. If you've got an older Xamarin project, it's not going to be there. This launch screen.zib, that's your loading screen. And I double clicked on that, and it's thinking because it's going to open it in Xcode. If y'all remember earlier, I mentioned that zibs are edited in Xcode, not in the designer. But as soon as I save it here, it updates the Xamarin project. It's the same file. So you don't have to worry about moving files over or copying files or any of that. You just edit it, save it, you're done. Okay, it's proving me wrong. So if it ever doesn't load, you can expand your project name, and then it'll be in the root of your project, and then you can open it and edit it. Any questions about that? There's not much you can do in your launch screen. I don't think you can even have custom fonts. We had some problems with that. The designer wanted us to have a custom font, so we ended up just doing an image. It was easier that way. But it's a zib. It's very similar to what you see in the designer for the storyboards. The other great thing about zibs is you can, so if you're using a table view, you can use that as a template to have a GUI editing interface to create your table cells with. So that's pretty much the basics. If you have any questions, so if you want a lovely Xamarin shirt like this, mine's kind of raggedy. I've worn it a lot. You can go to xamarin.com/shirt. Check out their project. You compile the project, run it. There's some things you have to like uncomment, I believe. You just uncomment it. You don't actually have to code it. And then you run the app, and then fill in the form, and they'll send you a free shirt. And just a little hint, there's something in there that you can put in there that they'll send you a monkey, or at least there used to be. I don't know. I didn't find out about it till later, so I didn't get the monkey, but I go to lots of Xamarin events, so I get monkeys.
I think there's also an F-sharp app that you can do the same thing for.
Is it F-shirt?
F-sharp?
No, the URL. Is it?
Sure.
Okay. If you have any questions, again, my name is Sean Sparkman. I'm here every month, just about, and my email and Twitter account. We've started our own Slack for the user group. There's also a Xamarin chat one, but the one that we've created is for local developers who come to this meeting at least once, hopefully, maybe, or try to. I don't know. You can ask us questions, and we'll try to help you out. There's Xamarin chat on Slack. I don't have the URL. If you email it to me, I can also get you that URL. But if you want an invite to our local one, send me an email, and I'll send you an invite. And you can use it to network, chat about whatever, as long as it's appropriate. It doesn't get too risque. Any other questions?
Well, you probably don't really know this, but I know that they were recently started kind of giving out a free version of it, or for already established developers. Have you seen anyone receive that yet?
So there is the indie license, which is month to month. It's fairly inexpensive. How much is it? $25 per platform per month, which is fairly inexpensive if you've got a 3-month project or 4-month project. You know, just throw that up there, get it done.
They have a free one, but the free one is you can't use Xamarin Forms, and it has to be less than 128K.
Yeah, it's fairly small.
Yeah, how much is 108? How big is something like that?
Oh.
I mean,
Well, see the problem. Let me compile it as a debug or release mode. So if you compile it and release, it uses the linker and it reduces the size of the app, so it's much smaller. I don't think I generate the IPA though.
I wrote an app not too long back with Xamarin Forms, maybe 7 individual screens. It was like 40 megabytes.
Yeah, most of the problem.
40 meg.
Yeah, all the Google packages. Also, I had
Is that debug or release?
that was released. I had issues with the linker, so I wasn't able to.
Oh, well, you might ask for help with that because that's really big.
Yeah, 40
So-
meg.
so-
40 meg's pretty big.
For a 7-screen app. So the most of your app size is going to be taken up by images, not by code. And if you go out there, if you want to look and see if your app is big in comparison to other ones, install the release version on your device, the non-debug version, and look at the storage size compared to other apps. They've gotten a lot bigger than they used to be. So I think like Facebook is like 128 or something like that without looking at the cached images and such. And that's pretty big, and they don't have a lot of images that aren't downloaded. So it's become less of a concern than it used to be, where I'd hear back if the app was like 7 megs. The other thing you have to look at is when you create your IPA, which is what is published, right, and what they download and expand, is a lot smaller than the app once it's installed. So that's zipped, compressed.
What's the limitation on the free one for 128K? What's that? Is that the?
You could have images in the app, small images, or you can have code.
No, but is it the final version compiled,
I don't know.
or is it the IPA, or is it?
You'd have to ask Xamarin. I'm sure they'll answer you real quick if you want to ask. The other option is if you do open source, you can apply for an open source license, but you can only use that for open source. But if you're doing open source and you've already got your .NET library out there for some open source project and you want to convert it for Xamarin, that's really cool that they offer that. Not a lot of people do that. So yeah, there's a free student license. You have to apply for it though.
I ran into that licensing issue. You can open up a project, but then when you go to compile it, it'll tell you that it's over a certain size, and you have to upgrade the license.
All right. Go ahead and stop this. Where do I stop that? All right.